Okay, so let's start. I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Should We Play College Football This Fall in a COVID-19 World? Our speaker today is Dr. Sheldon Jacobson. And before we start the webinar, I would like to mention a few things. Can you, yeah. So all attendees are muted. And if you would like to ask any questions, please use Q&A button to post questions. And if your questions are already asked, you can use thumbs up button to upvote a question you would like answered. And you can post questions anytime during the webinar. And all questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. And this webinar is recorded and it will be shared later. And this webinar is sponsored by the Informed Student Affairs Committee. I'm the chair of the Informed Student Affairs Committee. My name is Tülay Clement. I'm an assistant professor in the Economics and Business Department at the Colorado School of Mines. And today, as the chair of the Informed Student Affairs Committee, I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sheldon Jacobson. He is a founder professor of computer science at the University of Illinois. He also founded Bracketout, which is a STEM learning lab, and its academic focus is sharing and providing information and data to help people better understand and enjoy the NCAA men's basketball tournament, and also answer questions when the outcomes of the games unfold. And he also has many published articles in the media related to COVID-19. And Dr. Jacobson has many published research papers in the area of sports analytics. And today he's going to talk about, should we play college football this fall in a COVID-19 world? So before we start, I would like to also mention that if you are interested in talking to Dr. Jacobson or for any media inquiries, please contact to Ashley Smith from the email address asmith@informs.org. So I would like to again welcome our speaker, Dr. Sheldon Jacobson. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I want to thank everybody for joining us as well. For those of you on the East Coast, it's in the afternoon. For those of you on the West Coast, it is, of course, still in the morning. We're going to start out with a little poll. So let's put that poll right up because all of you, I'm sure, are interested in college football and specifically in college sports in general. So we have a poll and we want to know, do you think we should have college football this year? There are four options. One is yes, we should have it in the fall, business as usual. Number two is yes, but we should wait until the spring, see how things unfold. The third one is no, we should not have any college football this year. The environment just is not safe enough. And the fourth one is no, we should never have college football ever again. It should not exist. So why don't you take a few seconds to put your preference, and then we will see what the results of the polls are. So Tracy is going to calibrate them, and at some point she will indicate that there's enough of you who have voted that we will in fact have the results.
This is good. It looks like most people are voting here.
Oh, good.
Give it another few seconds.
A few more seconds, and then we will see what the results are, and then after we go through this presentation, we'll have a better idea of where people stand, and you may think I should have changed my vote, or your vote is in fact what you expected. So we're going to find out shortly. Why don't we see the results now, Tracy?
Okay.
Okay, so 12% say yes, we should have football in the fall. 46% indicate that we should wait to the spring. 42% do not think we should have it, and nobody is anti-football. So that's a nice thing. I kind of expected that to be the case. So that being said, now let's talk about, should we play college football this year? You know, we are dealing with COVID-19. Before we get into the football aspect, let's have a very, very brief summary of where we are and how we got here. You know, the SARS-CoV-2 virus began back in November. It seems like it was very recently, but the fact is, you know, time has passed. And the Chinese government, where it had its roots in Wuhan, China, took unprecedented action to basically quarantine entire areas and cities, as we saw. They were able to limit the spread in China quite significantly, but it did escape and it began to spread around the world, as we are now experiencing here in the United States. Just to give you a little bit of data, back on May 19th, There were almost 5 million cases worldwide, with almost 1/3 deaths, with around 2 million people recovered. In the United States, we were at 1.5 million cases, slightly under 100,000 deaths, and a little over 1/3 recovered. If we fast forward to June 26th, then the world was up to almost 10 million cases, almost 500,000 deaths, and a little over 500,000 recovered. In the US, we were at 2.5 million cases. We were at around 1/8 million deaths, 126,000, and a little over 1 million had recovered. Fast forward to the end of the day yesterday, 20 million worldwide cases, almost 750,000 deaths. I suspect by today we will be at that point. Over 13 million recovered. In the United States, we have crossed the threshold of 5 million cases. We've had a little over 166,000 deaths, approximately 1/6 of 1 million, and a little over half the cases have already recovered, a little over 2.7 million. So that being the case, let's take a look at this following situation. And there are different models that forecast what's going to happen. One possible scenario is that for the rest of the year, we'll average 800 deaths per day. In 2021, it will be down to 500 deaths per day. And in 2022, we'll be down to 250 deaths per day. And this will accumulate that we could see over 500,000 deaths, 550,000. This is one possible scenario. Now, how do we change the scenario? We change it with an effective treatment and ultimately a vaccine that is safe, effective, and we can get it to the people, which is, of course, critical. So what are the lessons learned so far? We believe, and this is based on what I've read, that 30 to 60% of the US population may actually get infected. And you think this is an enormous number of people, as we'll see. An infection fatality rate over the entire population would be under 1%. It's estimated to be around 0.6%. I think that estimate's actually coming down a little bit. But there's a very, very uneven population demographic in terms of the risk. If we look back in the 1918 Spanish influenza, that hit hard the people who were 20 to 40-year-olds. This particular virus that we're dealing with, COVID-19, if you're over 65, it's hitting you the hardest. So very different demographic in terms of the risk profiles. So what are some of the challenges we're dealing with? As I said, if you're over 65 years of age, if you have an underlying health condition, including obesity, diabetes, you're much more at risk for having a bad outcome. Hospitalization, ending up in an ICU, on a ventilator, and ultimately dying. There's been some effective treatments, though it's quite limited. Remdesivir has shown some promise in reducing hospitalizations. But the real challenge is that there are so many asymptomatic or mild case carriers, people who don't even know they're infected, and maybe they have a sniffle, a little cough for a day or two, and they don't even notice it. 80 to 95% of the infections may fall into this group, and a whole 40% may actually be completely asymptomatic. They have no idea that they are a carrier and potentially contagious and can transmit it to other people. So how are we going to get this under control? Well, there's really, one thing that is so critical is a rapid, reliable, low-cost test. If we can develop that, literally an at-home test, then this is a game changer, because before you leave every day in the morning, you can see if you're positive. And if you are, you don't leave. If you're not positive, you're fine. And there are, of course, limitations of that, but this really would reduce the transmission of infections from asymptomatic people, because if they test positive with no symptoms, then we're in a much better situation to control it. Without that, we need a vaccine, and we certainly need an effective treatment. But this would be at the very core of how we can get this under control. Now, barring that, of course, what can we do? There are the so-called non-medical countermeasures, stay-at-home orders, which we all went through, very blunt instrument, and we've had enough stay-at-home fatigue that, that's just not something that we can tolerate anymore. Washing your hands, hygiene, so simple, just wash your hands. Just wash them as often as you can, and it prevents the transmission of the virus if it's on your hand, literally to yourself. Physical distancing, staying 6 feet apart from people is absolutely critical, and some kind of face covering. Then once again, it's back to the testing. The antigens are when are you positive today? The antibodies, have you been exposed and developed antibodies so that you were in fact infected, even if asymptomatic at some point in the past. So what's the likely end game? Well, like I said, 30 to 60% of the population can get infected. We're talking about 100 million to 200 million people in the United States. Fatalities, and I give you a range here. I gave one possible scenario before, and it could be anywhere between a little under 500,000 deaths to 1 million deaths through 2022, unless we change the trajectory. And the key is effective treatments or a safe vaccine that can be widely distributed. And a safe and effective vaccine is an ideal, but effective treatments could be a game changer as well. So what are the challenges that we're facing right now? One is when you reopen communities, you bring people together, you have these surges of cases, and you want to limit the number of hospitalizations because there's a limited capacity so you can treat people as best you can. The good thing about what we've seen in this recent reopenings, which have occurred in July and August and a little bit at the end of June, is that the demographics of the infections have shifted way down in age. And as a result, these people are being infected, but they're not having bad outcomes at the same rate. The downside, though, is that there's a lot of them. And this enormous quantity of infections does have some risk associated with it. So we ultimately need an environment that will limit the spread of the virus, also be able to control the hospitalizations and the deaths and have the capacity to be able to deal with people. But it does come down to having effective treatments and a vaccine. So that's kind of the real game changer. Well, let's now talk about college football. And we are all in a process right now that we're waiting for the different conference leaders to announce whether we're going to have, for the 5 power conferences, football. And based on the poll, it's clear that a lot of people are concerned about having college football in the fall. Most people think we should wait to the spring. Well, college football is a major driver at certain universities in terms of their athletic department budget. It supports non-revenue sports. So if you want to have tennis, you need to have football. If you want to have gymnastics, you need to have football. And people kind of are itching for some college sports of some point. When March Madness was abruptly stopped because of COVID-19, it left a tremendous void. We accepted it considering that we didn't know much about COVID-19, but we know a lot more today. And what can we do to use that information to help guide this process for college football? So CBS Sports back on June 30th, Dennis Dodd issued a story, and he said that I expect a 30 to 50% infection rate among the 13,000 FBS players, and this could lead to 3 to 7 deaths. And what had happened since that time is I've looked at more data, gained better data, and now come to different conclusions. Conclusions that maybe may surprise some of you, may frighten some of you, but it's important we look at what the data says, because ultimately we should be listening to the data, not the people who are doubting that it's possible. And if we do that, we have a chance to at least understand how the facts, not the fears, should inform the decisions that we're trying to make. So what I've done is I look back over the last 10 years, and this is actually available on Wikipedia, anybody can find it. And I said in the last 10 seasons, from 2010 to 2019, how many college football players died? And it turns out there were 98. If I limited myself to the FBS team, the Football Bowl Series teams, there were 42. The most common causes were either accidents, shootings, or homicides, or some kind of health or illness related. Here's the data. And if you notice, there's a number and there's a number in parentheses. The numbers are all football players among any teams, could be any division. And then the ones in brackets focus specifically on the FBS team players. So we see that accidents certainly are the driving force for deaths. And health related are second, and then homicides and shootings are third. There's been a handful of suicides, and there's been 3 which just couldn't be classified. So this is not something that you read about, that we are already, in fact, tolerating around 4 deaths per year for college football. And we've been tolerating that for the last 10 years. We've taken safeguards to protect the players as much as possible, but accidents do occur, homicides and shootings do occur, and this causes death. So this is the basis upon which we're going to begin this dialogue and this discussion. So with that being said, what I wanted to do is now estimate the number of COVID-19 excess deaths among college football players, not deaths that would occur anyways, but beyond the normal deaths, the excess deaths. And I'm going to focus my attention just on the 130 football bowl series, the FBS teams. So that's like the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the ACC, SEC, Big 12, the MAC, so forth. Now, some of these conferences have already announced they're not playing this year. So in some sense, we've already shrunk the pool. So what assumptions am I making? Well, anytime you do modeling, you have to make certain assumptions. And the first one I'm going to make is that a football team will play only if the institution, the college or the university that it's in, has in-person education of some sort. If you don't bring people back to campus, you can't just bring the football players back or any other athletes. So as a result, let's focus purely on the fact that certain institutions are going to have some form of in-person education. And the other assumption I make is that once you bring people back to campus, they all share a risk of infection, which is common. And as a result, this common risk will in fact permeate across the student athletes, the non-student athletes, and basically society. This is an age group which has certain instincts, and as a result, they will operate in a certain way. So let's give the demographics of the players so we know what we're dealing with. They are typically men between 18 and 24. Approximately 20 to 25% of them are clinically obese. They tend to be linemen. A little under half of them are Black. And because they want to play football, they are highly motivated to not get infected. So they're going to behave themselves in ways that it's possible that they may not have as many accidents as we've seen in the past. So there may be a protective factor for them to be playing. We don't know that for sure, but it is a possibility. But their motivation is very clear. And we know that because initially there was a surge in positives when they showed up on campus in June, and then it disappeared for the most part. What about the coaches? I think we have to bring them into the equation because the coaches are a critical component of every team. They're typically at least 11 people. We have a head coach, and then we have assistant coaches. We have a defensive and offensive coordinator. They range in age from 25, in other words, they've just finished playing, and now they are ready to begin their coaching career, and to 75 years old. We have some very old coaches. I looked at some of the FBS teams just to get an idea, and if you look at the head coaches alone, there were 38 that were over 55, and there were 18 that were over 60. So we have a large group just among the head coaches, and then I did not look at the offensive and defensive coordinators and others on the staff. So the basis of my analysis is to compute something called an annual per capita death rate. And that's the number of deaths per year among 10,000 people in a particular demographic cohort. It can be based on age, it can be based on gender, it can be based on race. So I took the data that I had available to me, and here are some of these APCDRs. So for example, for college football players, we said there were 42. So it's going to have an annual per capita death rate of 3.2. You're going to see a plus or minus 1.2. What I'm doing is creating something called a confidence interval, because I don't know for sure what it's going to be. There's uncertainty in the data. So this gives me a range of values where the true value will fall somewhere in between. For 18 to 24-year-old males in 2019, this number was 11.3 deaths per 10,000. I then looked from the 1st of March to the 30th of May, a 13-week period, and looked at the deaths that were occurring for 18 to 24-year-olds. And it was, once again, kind of very typical, 11.1 plus or minus 0.4. Then I focused on, well, what about COVID deaths? And for COVID deaths, we had an interval of 0.17 deaths per 10,000 18 to 24-year-old males, and it's plus or minus 0.08. There's a certain amount of uncertainty around this. And then I focused on these older coaches, 45 to 64, and that was 12.1 plus or minus 5.4. So we're talking about a little over 12 deaths on average per 10,000 males between 45 and 64. So you realize that the coaches have a much higher COVID-19 risk factor than the athletes themselves. Well, that being said, what matters here? What's important about this? One is that age is important. If the older you are, the more risk you have of death and bad outcomes. Gender actually matters. It turns out men die at a higher rate than women, just the way COVID-19 has been, at least what the data says. And then underlying health conditions matter as well. For example, for those under 65, but typically older, if they have an underlying health issue like obesity, like diabetes, then they are at higher risk for a bad outcome. And once again, this gives you a rough idea of the important factors that go into assessing the risk. What about infections themselves? There are a number that are confirmed. We often call them a case, a confirmed case. But then there's all these people who are asymptomatic who have never been tested, and they fall into the unconfirmed group. The other issue, of course, is we have different types of situations. We have people who show symptoms, they get the cough, they get the fever, they get all the things that are classic symptoms. But then you have all the people who are just as infected, but they are asymptomatic. They don't show any symptoms. And then there are people who currently are asymptomatic, but they eventually become symptomatic. So they are pre-symptomatic. All of these people can pass on the virus. They are all contagious. So that being said, the CDC did some data collection, and what they observed, and this is of course going back in March and April and May, is that for every confirmed case that is confirmed with a test, there may be between 6 and 24 infections out there. So what I needed to do is compute then, based on the deaths that we observed in different age groups, what was the corresponding infection rate? And when I did that for 18 to 24-year-olds, it turned out to be 3%. That was the infection rate, which includes symptomatic and asymptomatic. For the older group, the 45 to 64-year-olds, it was 4%. So this was important information for us to have to be able to assess risk. So what this tells us is, since the infection rate includes people who have symptoms and are asymptomatic, then we know that because of this 6 to 24 time multiplier for every case there's an infection, that means that younger people have a lot more infections than maybe we thought initially, but they showed no symptoms. So as a result, they can still transmit the virus, but they do not get the bad outcomes associated with the virus. So let's now look at the concept of risk-based thinking applied to COVID-19 for college football. Because if we're going to have a death, it seems likely that the death is not going to occur with a player. It's going to occur with one of these older coaches. And the fact is, this is true. Well, how do we quantify that? Let's call threat simply what a COVID-19 death would be. And we can change death later, but we'll do it for death now. A low-risk person would be a player. I'll label them as an LR. A high-risk player or a person would be a coach. I'll label them as HR. And there's something in our field called the law of total probability, where we can write down the probability of having any death if college football occurs, depending on whether we have it to be a player or being a coach. We can then make assumption that there's a lot more players than coaches. In fact, I'm using a multiplier of around 9. And we know, based on the age demographic, that if you're a coach, you have a much higher risk of death than if you're a player. We already saw that from the data. The data speaks to that. So under this assumption, I can actually compute or estimate the probability of a death occurring if we played college football. It's just a formula based on probability and the data. I can then apply something called Bayes' rule, and then given that we see a death, what's the probability it'll be a player? I go kind of crunch through these numbers based on the data, and I come up with a really, really small number, it turns out. Epsilon is in general a really small value. It's a Greek letter. For coaches, though, much higher. And what this tells us is that if we're going to have a death when we play college football, it's going to be the coaches. It's not going to be the players. So the key point from this is I could have changed threat to be anything. It could have changed it to be hospitalizations, to being in an ICU on a ventilator, and the same conclusions hold. The problem is not the players. The problem is the coaches. So here's the magic numbers that you've likely been looking for. What are the expected number of deaths in FBS? And what I've done is I've made it as a variable based on the infection rate in the populations. If it was 5% all the way up to 30%. And this is different from what I proposed before, where I had projected 30 to 50%, But the data coming in, the last I saw, we had around 800 infections among 13,000 players. That's around 6 to 7%, and that's where we are right now. On the other hand, for the coaches, I don't know how many have been infected. They haven't reported that. But what we see is that for 13,000 players, we'd have to get up to 20% when we start to see an expected number of deaths, kind of including even one. While for the coaches, once you get to around 10%, the 0.79 plus or minus 0.35, that means the lower bound would be 0.44, the upper bound would be a little over 1.14. That's when you get concerned, which means that the players can tolerate more risk than the coaches. And remember, you have 13,000 players I'm talking about the oldest coaches, 520 coaches. There's 25 times more players than coaches, yet the coaches will tolerate much less infections before you start to see bad outcomes. So what are the key findings from this? Anything you can do to limit infections will reduce the player COVID-19 deaths. Bubbles work. We're seeing that with the National Hockey League. We're seeing it with the NBA. It really does work. And the key is playing safe teams. People say, oh, gee, if we play, we're going to be transmitting it. If nobody on the field is infected and has the infection currently or is positive currently, you cannot transmit it. You have to have someone infected. So playing safe teams is a way to reduce risk. Now, all this tells us also is that if we look at the excess deaths, even if we got up to a 20% infection rate among the students, we're still talking about maybe 1 excess deaths to COVID-19. We're already tolerating 4 per year for the last 10 years on average. So we have to put that in perspective that nobody seems to want to talk about. So the players really are safest when they're in their bubbles. In fact, by cutting games, you're making it riskier for the players because any time they're not playing is time that they are subject to comparable risk in the community if they venture out of their bubble. So cutting games is actually a way to increase infection risk, not reduce it. What about the older coaches? They are the problem in this situation. And they can get infected by asymptomatic players if one sneaks in. The asymptomatic player can infect another player, but if they infect an at-risk coach, we have a problem. In general, by looking at the data among the COVID-19 deaths, if we look at the excess deaths due to COVID-19 for the older coaches, it increases their overall death risk by 13% from a somewhat small but medium number. For a very small number, for the players, it only increases it by 1.5%. This tells us that the players aren't the issue, the coaches are the issue. Now, there are limitations to everything I just went through. One is the data quality, and actually the data changes weekly. And I do an update every week, and I gave you the numbers that were the most current numbers. If you had the numbers from the previous week, they were slightly different. They don't change a lot, but they do change a little bit. And the other thing is I had to estimate the infection rate versus the case rate, and that is non-trivial. And if I'm off by a little bit, it just shifts things a little bit. But once again, it is a limitation of the study. And then the virus transmission, how is it being transmitted? We're assuming it's being transmitted through droplets, but if it's airborne, that creates another level of risk. And we just don't know how the data will inform that. So what are the implications of this? If you're going to have measures, countermeasures to protect people, always protect the most vulnerable group, but you don't have to have as much protection for the less vulnerable group. Now, this principle applies to college football. It also applies to college basketball, something that I've written a paper on now, which is under peer review, and we'll be discussing in the coming weeks. It applies to university openings, church reopenings, aviation security, where this idea actually began, where I started my research on this, going back 20 years now. All of these ideas will still apply. Protect the most vulnerable group, but not at the expense of the least vulnerable groups. So what are my key points here? Risk should be managed and mitigated. You can manage the risk and you can reduce it and suppress it to mitigate it. But it should not be avoided, it should not be ignored, it should not be run away from. If you do that, you're in trouble. So how do you manage risk? You play college football with players in bubbles and you protect the at-risk coaches. How do you avoid risk? You ban all the activities in the name of protecting the most vulnerable people. In other words, you let fear rather than facts dictate the decisions. And that is what we're seeing right now with the chancellors and the presidents of these major conferences and teams. So non-risk-based thinking basically says a one-size-fits-all is how we'll work. We're trying to find the needle in a haystack. We'll treat every part of the haystack exactly the same. But one-size-fits-all don't work. They never have worked. We've seen it in our federal government. We've seen it throughout society. It just doesn't work. While risk-based thinking says, let's partition the haystack into the low-risk and the high-risk people and take the appropriate measures which are commensurate with their risk. And by doing so, we're actually creating a more optimal environment of risk management. So what are the takeaways from all of this? Anything that can be used to protect the high-risk haystack, in other words, the coaches, has positive health implications. That's an important thing. Avoiding one-size-fits-all policies and strategies, which means no football, is suboptimal and once again is not informed by the data. And then the other thing is watching for unintended consequences. You know, if you have fewer games, then you're actually increasing the risk to the players because they're outside of the bubble more. If you cancel football, it's possible these players who have made a strong commitment to play, who have worked very hard to stay compliant, will be very frustrated, and you may actually see a surge of infections among them because they just won't care. These are unintended consequences that have to be considered. So I encourage you to look at the facts and not allow the fear to inform decisions. And the data does speak. The doubters may be loud, but the data does not lie. And if we put the right protocols in place, I believe we can play just about any team sport this year. We're seeing that with the NBA and the NHL. Major League Baseball has been a bit of a mess at times, and they'll get their act together eventually. I wrote an opinion expressing many of these views, which happened to appear yesterday in The Hill, and you can certainly go there, and it's called Who is at Risk if College Football is Played This Fall? And the hint is it's not the players. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I hope you've all enjoyed this, and hopefully now you have a little bit of better perspective on the situation that we're in with college football. And as a result of that, it enables us to make informed decisions based on the data so that we can make these choices in the best interest of everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Professor Jacobson, for this great talk. We have some questions. I would like to read that one by one to you.
Sure.
I will start with the first question. Why was athletic department staff not included? Other university staff that need to be there to take care of athletes. This is about slides 20, 21, and 22.
Slide 20, 21, and 22. Let's go back. Okay.
I can read it again. Why was athletic department staff not included? Other university staff that need to be there to take care of athletes.
I am including them, but the staff, for example, student assistants and some of the, what I'll call the minor coaches, they are not in the age cohort that causes a problem. They're in the 25 to 45 age range. And as a result of that, the risk profile for them is, it's worse than the athletes, but not significantly. So I could easily include that and it would have a slight blip on the risk.
Thanks a lot. And the second question is, what is the risk if a bubble can't be maintained?
Well, that's an important question.
Yeah.
So much of this relies on the players working together for their common good. And their motivation is that if there's one infection, they may have to sit out. If that infection becomes 6 or 8 people, it could jeopardize the team, which results in games being forfeited and ultimately a season coming to an end. So the expectation is you may have that. I would suspect if we had 130 FBS teams, you will end up with a certain number of them having that occur. And that is the price that has to be paid. The question is, if our expectation is that everybody stays infection-free, that expectation is unreasonable. There will be some teams that will have to drop out. But why should we penalize all teams when a few are not being compliant, or sometimes by accident an infection does occur?
Right. Thanks a lot. And for the next question, should they play with public attendance?
Should spectators be there? I assume that's what the question is. Is that what you mean?
Should they play with public attendance? Probably, yeah, with the audience.
And that's something that depends on the size of the stadiums and the arenas that we're working with. For the professional games, they're all leaving spectators out. They just don't want to have to deal with that. But when you look, it's very clear that if you have an almost by reservation only controlled entrance and exit and space the people out, you can have a small number of people in the audience. It will look very, very sparse, but it is possible to do that. Do they have to have that? Obviously, they don't have to. But once again, that does add a measure of risk, and that has to be taken into account in the risk equation. So I'm not here to endorse that nor to refute that should happen. It's just something that has to be considered.
I assume that it's not like, it's also like how we use the classroom capacities. It's not going to be used like full capacity by performing social distancing.
Right? I'm teaching a class this semester which holds like 400 people, and I have 50 people in the class.
Yeah. And at the end, there is a discussion about risk, but the argument about risk doesn't take into account that the university leaders are worried about litigation should someone get infected. That's a different kind of risk.
Well, there are going to be infections on campus. When you bring back, 20,000 people, I'll use Purdue as an example because Mitch Daniels has been very vociferous about having a business as usual campus. So we have 45,000 students coming to campus at Purdue in West Lafayette. Let's suppose they have, and I'll be very, very conservative, 2% infection rate. So we're talking about 900 people showing up on campus with positives. If they are allowed to roam for 24 hours with positives, then those 900 will easily become 2,000 within a few days. So testing right away and then quarantining and isolating people as rapidly as possible, because the infections initially aren't the problem. It's if they become community transmission, and that's when the problems become more severe.
Thanks a lot. And the next question is there evidence that the 4-player deaths from suicide, homicide, health per year you mentioned we are tolerating are directly linked to the playing of football and not external factors?
We don't know. We don't know. I can't go into the mind of a young man or who has a terrible accident or commits suicide. I mean, these are tragic things. These are horrific things. I don't know the reason. What I do find interesting is that football has, like I said, in the FBS teams, we've had 42 deaths in the last 10 seasons. I did the same thing with basketball. I found 1 death. And I can't explain why football players are more prone to death than basketball players. It doesn't make any sense why that should be the case, because some of these factors have nothing to do with playing any sport. I mean, homicides and shootings or some kind of accident, because many of these accidents have nothing to do with the sports. They're often automobile accidents, for example, or falls of some sort. I can't explain that. I don't know.
That's interesting. I don't know much about sports, but I don't know if there are specific body features of each type of sports players. I don't know if it would be, I don't know, yeah.
Sure.
So next question is, I question your assumption that schools will only play football if all students return to campus. However, if we assume that is true, how do these students athletes attend classes in the fall if they need to be contained in their own bubble?
Mm-hmm. Well, if we didn't have in-person education at an institution and we only bring back the football players, then they will be in their own bubble, but ultimately they have to do some of the education. So they're at the same level of risk, but they also will travel. They will also be more present in a community, and that does have some risk with it, while the students who would not be on campus would not be exposed to that. So my basic assumption is we should see a comparable level of risk between student athletes and non-student athletes, and they should be treated risk-wise in the same manner. That's why I make that assumption.
Thanks. And the other question is, the second assumption on slide 18 is not right. From what I hear, the universities are doing more to protect the student athletes, isolating them in different ways than the general student population.
That is correct, and it varies by institution by institution. However, once again, if you have in-person education, they will be exposed to what happens in the general community. And even though it may not be exposed at the same level of time, it will still have some exposure. And that's the underlying assumption that I make.
Thanks. And the next question is, do you think that football-specific activities, for example, huddles and pile-ups after a fumble, would affect virus transmission? As far as I know, there was no football practice in spring 2020, so there is no data on that. Follow on, I have read that there is evidence that the severity of COVID-19 infection is related to the amount of virus transmitted in the infecting event. I'm concerned that the transmission rate among young men playing football will be higher than what we have seen so far among the players' age group.
Well, you don't have to worry about transmission on the playing field if nobody on the playing field is infected. That's the key. You want to keep the infections off the playing field, and that is the critical factor, and that's why testing is so rigorous. I've been most impressed by the National Hockey League of how they've created their bubbles, and true, they have certain privileges being a professional league that the college athletes cannot do. But as long as you can keep the infections off the field, it doesn't matter what people are doing. This virus just doesn't magically occur. If you're infected, then you can transmit the disease. And when you're playing, if you're infected, the key is not being on the field if you are infected. That is the key.
Thanks. And the next question is, how many of the fatalities on slide 16 were from playing football? Shouldn't excess fatalities due to COVID-19 be measured relative to the risk of playing football rather than events like car accidents and shootings?
Well, I'll answer that in two ways. One is the ones related to football, for example, are not homicides and shootings, and they're not directly related to suicide. The accidents that I observed tended to be more outside of football, and some of the health-related occurred while they were playing football. So that is true. However, when you go to basketball, you see one death over 10 seasons. And that tells me, yes, there is some risk to playing football. And some people say we should use COVID-19 to completely eliminate football. It's a violent sport. And that's we have a right to express those views. College football is violent at times. This is a fact. We've tolerated it for many decades, and this is the result of it. So accepting that or not accepting it or like it or not liking it is not the issue. These are just the facts.
Thanks. And will all student athletes have to attend online classes only? And if so, will this be accommodated by the university?
I think it varies from university to university. It depends on the institution. So it's very hard to answer that unless there was a specific school and then how they're following their protocols. I mean, there's a certain amount of academic advising and support that goes on to athletes that many non-student athletes don't have access to. All these protocols are being considered, and they will be given the greatest care they need to not only advance academically so they can get their degree, but also stay COVID-19 free.
And the next question is, your data shows that with an infection rate of 20% or less on campus, the expected excess death rate among CFB players would be less than 1, correct? Is that under a full bubble environment? Also, can you expand a bit on your statement that players would be safer if more games were played?
The expected deaths are based on the age cohort in the population and the rate at which they would get infected. The use of bubbles is critical to keep the infection rate down. Right now, I said we're around 7%. It will creep up, and as long as it stays under 10% with a 95% confidence interval, the expected number of deaths is well below 1. It doesn't mean it can't occur, it's just highly unlikely to occur. What was your second question? No.
I can go to the second
It was a
question.
long question.
Yeah, is that under a full bubble environment? Also, can you expand a bit on your statement that players would be safer if more games were played?
Okay, once again, when they're playing games, they are in a more controlled environment than when they're not playing games. If you look at the success of the National Hockey League, it's not the 3 or 4 hours per day when they're playing the game, preparing for the game, coming off the game. It's all the other hours that they're taking great pains to control. That's where the infections are spread. So as a result, by playing less games, you're giving the student athletes a little more latitude, and that latitude could lead to more infections. Can we quantify that? There's no data to support that. This is what I believe would be the case.
And the next question is, you understandably focus on fatalities, but there are also concerns of long-term heart and other health impacts. Should this be a consideration?
You can do the same analysis with any condition, hospitalizations or any long-term effects, and you would see different numbers. And in fact, these numbers would all be higher, obviously. The challenge right now is the paucity of data that we have to be able to make such an analysis. But the models that I've developed are fundamentally sound enough to take any outcome, be it death, be it cardiovascular issues coming up, you name it, and if I have the data, I can do the analysis for it.
So I think all these are the questions. So Professor Jacobson, should we play a college football in the fall?
And the answer definitively is maybe. It really depends on if you're willing to tolerate this level of risk. If I looked at this numbers and the people in the SEC or the ACC or the Pac-12 or the Big 10 or the Big 12, anywhere, came to me and said, what does this mean? I would explain to them the level of risk, look at the protocols in place, look at the protocols of the teams they're planning to play, look at how well thought through their bubble is. And based on all of that information, I'd be able to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. If you can mimic what the National Hockey League has done, which I think is a high bar, very high bar, then there's no problem in playing. It's going to be less than that for most teams. The other thing is that some teams have much more resources to protect the players and their bubbles than others. And if you have a team that doesn't have the resources to be able to achieve that level of protection in their bubbles, then you don't want to play. Part of it is you're just going to have too high an infection rate, and then that's going to seep to the coaches, and that's when you start to see relatively quickly some hospitalizations and ultimately some deaths could occur. If, on the other hand, you have the resources to protect everybody, there's no reason not to play.
Thanks a lot. So also Tracy have some suggestions regarding our discussion about the role of players in the decision, also the effect of this on other sports.
The role, I guess I don't understand your question.
The role of players in the decision.
The roles of player in the division?
Decision.
The roles of the player, I still don't understand you, I'm sorry.
Tracy, can you explain? Yeah.
Sure, sorry about that, I was on mute. So my question is, what about the players who are resisting being asked to play? They don't want to. How does that factor in?
The fact is, if you have fewer players, then all of my estimates go down. In other words, if you have, instead of 13,000 players, you have 12,000 players, then the expected number of deaths of the ones playing will all go down. That's it. Everything will scale, not quite exactly linearly, but close to that.
And Tracy, what about your other question, the effect on other sports?
Well, college football is kind of leading the pack, so to speak, in terms of college sports. And if we punt, no pun intended, on college football, then what does this mean for women's volleyball? What does it mean for women's soccer? What does it mean for basketball, another big revenue sport? What does it mean for baseball and hockey in different schools? This has tremendous implications. And that's why this decision that's being made about the Power Conference's decision has a wide footprint of influence. And I hope that they're being well informed to make it, because if you're making the decision based on fear rather than what the facts and the data indicate, you're really going to make a bad decision. Just use the information available, and be informed. And every university may make a very different decision. That's fine, as long as it's being made with good reason, not based on fear.
Right. Yes, thank you so much. I think these are all the questions from us and the audience. It's an honor for us to welcome you here today. Thank you very much for this great talk and this webinar for us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being here, and I hope everybody enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good one, everyone. Thank you.